Welcome to You First, the Disability Rights Florida podcast.
Greetings, I am your host, Keith Casaubon, and thank you for listening to the You First podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe. You can visit disabilityrightsflorida.org/podcast to listen or to find links to our show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and more. In episode 23, we talked about the representation of people with disabilities in the media, how that has evolved over the years, improving in some ways, but more often still faltering with poor and inaccurate portrayals of people with disabilities in popular media. A great point that was brought up was that one of the best ways to combat these issues was for people with disabilities to create their own content, to control the narrative, and help to create platforms where their stories, in their words, can be shared. My guests today, Elizabeth Wright and Jennifer Price, are doing just that. Elizabeth is a writer, activist, keynote, and TEDx speaker, and an Australian Paralympic medalist. She is also the founder and editor of Conscious Being magazine, a publication for disabled women by disabled women, and the editor of Disability Review magazine. Jennifer is a special education and disability rights attorney and author of Empowered, using real case examples to look deeper into IEP management. She is also the founder and CEO of Disability News Report, a TV streaming service that features content created by and for people with disabilities. Hi, Elizabeth and Jennifer. Thank you so much for being my guest today. I really appreciate it. So I want to start with you, Jennifer. Tell us a little bit about yourself, why you started Disability News Report, and what it offers for people with disabilities.
Hi, yes, thanks for having me. So I am a disability law attorney who really just found myself in different spaces at different points in time, having conversations with people with disabilities. And some of the frustrations or complaints that people would talk about concerned media representation. And I would see them maybe either in sort of town hall-ish type events where the media would be invited and no one would show, or even at conferences and events like that. And I think as a Black person, that really resonated with me because I understand the representation and authentic representation on top of that. And I saw this as an opportunity that should be addressed. I did some research and I realized that there is a wealth of content out there that's being created by people with disabilities, but for one reason or another, distribution just was not happening, or wasn't happening at the scale that maybe people would like for it to happen. So I really just saw this as a void and decided to address that need.
That's great. Thanks. Liz, also, please introduce yourself. Tell us why you launched Conscious Being magazine and how it can benefit people with disabilities.
Hi, thanks, Keith, for having me on the podcast again. I'm really excited to be here. I started Conscious Being purely because it was something that I wanted as a disabled woman myself. Growing up, I've always loved magazines and stuff like that. But, you look through Vogue or you look through even some of the more indie magazines and there's just not enough representation, or if there is representation, it's quite tokenistic in the way that it's done. And the community that I'm a part of, that we're all a part of, I know that there are so many interesting stories, perspectives, life experiences that are just not being heard. And even within the disability community, we're not being given the opportunity to actually hear those stories, even from within our own community. So that was really the reason I started Conscious Being was really for myself, but it just seems to have resonated so much with so many women and non-binary folk that we're really starting to represent. It's kind of starting to grow into something really special, which is nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to get the conversation started talking about your processes for selecting either pre-existing material or creating new and original content for your platforms. How do you find content, talent, collaborators, and so on? Jennifer, let's start with you.
Sure. So I will say I don't have my process down to an exact science, that's for sure, but I 100% have become a lot better with Google. I've considered Google to be my best friend. I loved it before. I love it even more now. And so I really just kind of went through Google to look for the talent. In terms of content ideas, some of the content ideas came from shows that I watched that I thought, I think that would be a great show to have, but the actor has a disability. And I've also taken cues from some of the other network channels. So I have done some research and subscribed to, say, Peacock, for instance, or Tubi TV, and I've looked to see some of the content that they're creating and where they're lacking and where content can be created, but insert a person with a disability as the actor in that role. So that's really where it's come from, either from watching content myself and seeing what I like or seeing what's being offered on other network stations. That's where that needs to be there. And then I will go to Google and see who's out there. And also I will say it's been incredibly nice just how helpful other people have been. So when I've reached out to someone, they've either agreed or said, I can't do it right now, I just have too much on my plate, but I can refer you to someone else. And so the referral process has been amazing, I will say, whether people can do it and then they say, and this person can do the editing or whatever, or someone cannot do it, but have referred me to someone who's able to.
Liz, how about you?
I think, obviously we've touched on Conscious Being that I edit, but I edit 2 other disability-led and focused magazines as well, Disability Review Magazine and Not Your Monolith. And certainly each magazine has its own framework, has its own focus and niche area. And it does mean that the way that I kind of find people, it can be very wide open and varied. I mean, quite often I do put call out for pictures, especially for Conscious Being and Not Your Monolith, specifically around certain themes that we might be exploring. So, for example, in the launch issue of Not Your Monolith, the theme is I Am. And for Conscious Being, this issue, which is a bit delayed, but hopefully by the time this podcast is out, issue 2 will be out, is around climate change and sustainability. So I'll put out specific pictures out on social media. Social media is my best friend when it comes to getting writers and stories, and I kind of use forms and that for people just to get some processes in place that I'm not being overwhelmed in my email box or anything like that. But sometimes stories can just come off the cuff and magically appear. And actually, even yesterday for Disability Review Magazine, I needed a particular story for a particular section of it. And I just put a random call out on Twitter in the hopes that someone might know someone with an interesting story. And off the back of that, I got a response from a woman whose husband is blind and he's a wood turner. And I was like, oh my God, that's brilliant. Like, let's go with that one. Right. It sounds really cool. So I think it's one of the things that I love about being an editor is just these amazing stories that you can just happen upon, and these amazing people with lived experience who I think are kind of bucking the stereotypes in a sense around what disability is. And if I can give them a voice through the publications that I edit, then yeah, I will do it as much as I can to my capability.
Both of your answers between Google and social media gave me the impression that it's not so much that the content's not out there, it's that the platform to share the content isn't always there. And so it seems like you guys are finding a lot of great content and now giving it a place to actually be shown to other people or read by other people or so on. So that's really great.
Yeah, and then Google can help you with the contact information.
Yeah.
It's true, Jennifer.
Or even social media. I've definitely reached out through Instagram, especially.
Sliding into those DMs. Yeah. Yep, you're just like, hello there.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Tell us about your perception of disability in the media, which we just sort of touched on, but let's talk a little bit more about that. Where do you see it now, and where do you hope to see it go in the future? We'll start with you, Liz.
Yeah, certainly. My impression is that the past few years things have been improving a little bit. I think off the back, we've just had the Paralympics, and obviously whenever the Paralympics are around, kind of disability gets a bit of a boost in the media. But again, that's only talking about a very specific experience or group of disabled people, because as I say to people, just as every non-disabled person doesn't want to be an Olympian, not every disabled person wants to be a Paralympian. So I think there have been improvements, but it's for me, it's certainly not fast enough or deep enough or richer enough in terms of its experience. You watch kind of TV shows, or you look through magazines or blogs or newspapers or listen to radio or stuff, and it's still, again, a lot of the time disability is connected to specific experience, such as wheelchair users or amputees or something like that. There's not that full, rich breadth of representation that I think is really needed, that would actually, through media, help to educate the non-disabled community around what disability is and how we actually engage with disabled people and the wider disabled community. So yeah, I think there's been improvements, but I think there's still a very long way to go. And this is why I really hope that kind of the work that Jennifer's doing, the work that I'm doing, will just help be part of that kind of pushing forward of that disability representation, and in the hopes that actually what Jennifer and I are doing and so many others are doing will become more mainstream and will become more just part of that. Non-disabled people will watch and read this content as well as disabled people.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Liz, and I really like that she brought up the lack of depth to some of what you see in the media. I mean, I think some of the problems definitely include the lack of depth, maybe sometimes the lack of stories, as I think Liz mentioned, the tokenistic aspect of some of the stories at times. So I think that it's changing. I know organizations here in the United States, such as Respectability, have become very, very fierce advocates in connecting with Hollywood to get better representation in the media, and better authentic representation, especially. And I know last year, so I think the study came out in 2020, so it included research up until 2019. The Annenberg Initiative indicated that only like 2.3% of the speaking roles in the media are going to actors with disabilities. So I think that it's definitely changing with Netflix coming out with all these statements, Disney Plus coming out with all these statements. I know but I think it's going in that direction. However, the point was made about the lack of depth, and that's true. Everyone with a disability doesn't want to be a Paralympian, right? And then the Paralympics only highlight and showcase people with physical disabilities. So then what about people with intellectual disabilities? I know we have partnered, our network has partnered with the Special Olympics of Pennsylvania. We're out here in Pennsylvania to highlight some of those athletes as well. And then what's nice about the Special Olympics of Pennsylvania is that they also will do feature content on some of the athletes themselves. So then if people are really interested in how they're doing, what they're doing today, then they can sort of follow them through some of these interview style shows as well. And I think that's important to show people in all respects, as well as maybe cooking. So our network has a series called My Shaky Life, where someone with cerebral palsy is cooking. So you can find out how to make some spaghetti and meatballs, or he did one with vegan chili, but the chef has a disability. So I definitely think that that's what's lacking. I definitely think that's the direction it should go. And it actually makes me think of a conversation that I had with someone who stated that one thing that he gets tired of is when people want to cast someone with a disability, they also feel the need to cast someone who doesn't have a disability for fear that, using his words, it would be maybe too disabled of a cast or too disabled of a show. So maybe that's the direction we can go, where there's not this negative perception on an entire cast having a disability. It's just, this is the cast and this is who we choose to be. And if everyone has a disability, then that just is what it is.
So, Jennifer, I know that you've got a big project in the works. You've got your first film, I think, in post-production right now called The Anxiety of Laughing. Tell us a little bit about that, and when do you expect it to be released?
Sure. So we are very excited about this one. This really just fell into my lap, and I said, yes, we would love to help produce and distribute it. So the film Anxiety of Laughing was written by someone, Andrew Justwig, who is actually a recent graduate of UC Riverside's media school. And he wrote it and just sort of had it, I guess, in his room sitting. And then I reached out to him for other content, and then he brought this up. And so we've decided to produce it. But it's about a couple. He's actually playing the role of the husband who has a disability. Andrew has cerebral palsy, and he's married to a woman who does not have a disability. And it goes through the dynamics behind that relationship, as well as dealing, using my word, with the mother/mother-in-law and all of her meddling and unsolicited advice and comments. And all of a sudden there is an unexpected event that happens in their marriage that really, I think, would require the audience to challenge and question, what does disability mean? What does it look like? Who really, out of all these main characters, who really has a disability? Because it just might not be Andrew.
Interesting. And when are you expecting it to come out, or what's it looking like? Yeah.
Yeah. So the release is going to be in October. We're looking around mid-October for the release. So in about 6 weeks or so.
Oh, that is exciting. Very cool. Now, Liz, I know you mentioned earlier you've explored the need for women with disabilities and non-binary people with disabilities to be better represented in the media, and how it feels to actually see your lived experience and other people's stories in print or on screen or so on. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for me growing up, I grew up in a very non-disabled family and non-disabled community. So I was born with my disability limb difference, and I went to a mainstream school, and I just never saw myself anywhere at any point until I really, so for listeners that don't know, I was a Paralympic swimmer as well. So until I kind of went to the Paralympics and was seeing other people who were limb different like myself, as well as having other impairments and conditions that enabled them to be at the Paralympics, there'd been no representation at all. And I never realized really how much that impacted me or meant to me until I was kind of part of the Paralympic movement. And then moving on from that, when I went to university and was studying fine art, and I came across disabled artists who were doing amazing work around visual representation of disability and stuff like that. And I realized actually that there is real power in seeing your experience reflected in not just your community or education or workplace, but also the media. And when I see the representation that is out there or has been out there over the past couple of decades, it's very cringeworthy. And Jennifer brought up about Netflix, how they've made a statement and they're doing better, and they are doing better. I've certainly watched a number of shows on Netflix where I've been quite impressed with the way that they've done a disability representation. But then I see that they have the movie Me Before You on there, and I hate that movie. It makes me cringe. It's not reflective of disability lived experience, and actually it really skews and biases non-disabled people's ideas about what disability is and how disabled people feel about their impairments and conditions. So for me, with doing the magazines, the reason I really stepped into editing Disability Review magazine, which was the first magazine I started on, was because I really saw that as an opportunity to really amplify the voices of the network and community that I was a part of. And I knew of so many amazing activists, or I know of so many amazing activists and advocates and storytellers and just disabled people who are literally have a really interesting perspective on life that is just never heard. And so taking on board these stories and giving them a chance to be in one of the magazines that I edit, it means that I am seeing myself, but I know our readers are seeing themselves in it as well, and that is really empowering for them. I've had feedback in terms of conscious being. I've had feedback from some of our readers there was a woman in Australia called Hannah who she bought the first issue, and she messaged me and said, I've never had a publication before where I felt so seen and heard in every single page. And that made me quite emotional, because that is what I wanted for myself. That was what I was aiming for in myself. But I think being an editor, and I'm sure both of you know, when you're very busy and you're just trying to get the work done, you can kind of miss the emotional aspect of it that maybe if you were more separate from it, you'd be able to experience. But Hannah was having that emotional response that I so desperately wanted for this magazine, for Conscious Being. So to hear her say that, in my mind, that was, well, job done. It was my aim. It's still my aim with that magazine. And, I think issue 2 is even better. And I think we've got even more diverse representation, and especially in terms of the theme for Conscious Being, this issue, which is sustainability and climate change. It's such an crucially important part of this world that we have to focus on right now. And I'm often asking myself, where is the disabled voice in this? And so, it's about providing these platforms where we can raise the voices of the disability community with their unique perspective on a lot of these topics and lived experience.
Well, question for you, Jennifer. Your service appears to cover such a broad range of disabilities and issues related to disability. I had a really great time just going through the entire platform, looking at all the variety of shows was really impressive. But I imagine there was also a number of challenges along the way to get to that point, and maybe even things you wish you could have included but weren't able to. So tell us a little bit about the challenges to build this broad network of content.
Well, so I think initially when I think about that question, one of the challenges that I can think of is defining the word disability, and then also whether I want to allow other people to define it. So when I say that, I mean, when I hear the word disability, I include all disabilities. It doesn't matter really what it is. Everyone has a story and everyone should be able to tell their story. But I know when I've talked to other people, like maybe my husband or whatever, people that are close to me, they may want to limit the definition on the theory that, well, it may be too broad or whatever. So I think those have been some of the challenges, just kind of being okay, especially in the beginning when I'm really just trying to feel everything out and feel out where the viewers are and what they like and don't like or are taking to, just using a broader definition of disability, which really encompasses everyone, and meaning mental health disability, physical disability, intellectual. It really doesn't, there's really no limit on it because, like I said, in my opinion, everyone has a story and should have their story out there and should be seen. So that was one of the challenges. And I've gone with the broad definition for now because I don't see anything wrong with it. If you can have 1,000 movies, then what difference does it make? And then I know another challenge was also came up with the audio descriptions. So we are going to be redoing the website, and part of the redo is to include audio descriptions, because once I watched a movie myself, I have to admit I was pretty ignorant on this topic of audio descriptions until I actually watched a movie and had a really much better appreciation for just how much it can change the context and viewing experience for someone who uses audio descriptions. So that was another challenge that I came up on, not initially having the audio descriptions. So then making sure going forward to include audio descriptions for the content that's out there.
And was there any content that you've or topic area that you really wanted to have represented on the channel, but you weren't able to do so? There's nothing that I am not able to do so. However, I am interested in making sure to include voices. I want to address the topic of the intersection of sex and disability, because that topic I feel like doesn't get discussed, or if it does get discussed, it's in this sort of demeaning way or whatever. So I definitely want to address that topic. And so that would say that subject might be a subject that I'm having a little bit harder time. And also I do want to make sure that there's representation of, people with disabilities who might be non-binary, members of the LGBTQ plus community. Those are stories that I am definitely looking to address, and I'm making sure that I am fully inclusive in that aspect as well. Liz, challenges you faced?
Definitely around accessibility. I mean, on across all of the publications that I edit, it's been a very steep learning curve, because, okay, I might have an impairment myself. I might identify as disabled myself, but case in point of the name of Not Your Monolith, I'm not a monolith of disability. I don't understand necessarily the access needs of someone with a visual impairment or hearing impairment or neurological condition or anything like that. So I've had to go on a really, really fast and steep learning curve. And I'm not afraid to say I've gotten it wrong, and I've had to apologize to people before and work even better and educate myself even more, because I am very passionate about inclusion, and I want to make all of these publications as inclusive as possible. So it's not even just thinking necessarily about, is this publication accessible by a screen reader? Have we provided a plain text document version of the publication? It's also thinking about colors. So for someone who may be dyslexic, are we using colors that it's not going to affect them? Maybe someone with epilepsy, maybe if there's some kind of, especially with the digital magazines, if we're using some kind of video or movement or something, whether in our social media or in the actual magazine, it's being aware of, is that going to negatively impact someone who has epilepsy? And it's very much an ongoing learning process, and one that I really am enjoying going on because it's expanding and broadening my knowledge. But, sometimes you do worry and you panic, like, have I done this right? Am I missing someone? Am I missing someone's experience that I am now excluding them from this magazine or my social media because I haven't got the access 100% right? So at the same time, I feel like I live with a certain degree of anxiety about accessibility buzzing underneath because I'm so worried that I maybe have missed something or I haven't got something quite right. So yeah, for me, that's been probably one of the biggest main concerns and aspects of being an editor and founder of magazines is just making sure you're getting that accessibility right.
Yeah, I mean, I just have to piggyback real quick because I have that same level of paranoia also. And I know when we do the relaunch in a week, I've just keep thinking about that. Like, oh my goodness, I think something is not going to be right.
And it's always your worst nightmare that someone's going to come to your launch event and go, why didn't you do this? And you're like, oh no.
Yeah. I definitely live with that paranoia constantly. And I remember talking to a filmmaker who, said, look, someone is not going to be happy, right? So just kind of learn to address their concerns and in a nice way and move on. Don't let it kind of sit and resonate and don't ruminate over it because you're not going to get it perfect 100% of the time. You just have to learn from your mistakes and move on. And that's easy to say, but there's still that paranoia. So.
Yeah, I can relate with as well with not just the podcast, but any other media that we create here at Disability Rights Florida. Same thing. We want to make sure it's accessible to as many people as possible. And with the podcast, we had people asking about captions, and I'm like, well, it's audio only. Where would we put the captions? But enough people asked that now we put it on YouTube so we can have captions. If that's what people want, that's fine. So we did it, but it was just an interesting question that I kind of had to scratch my head a little bit, but that's fine. Now it's not video. It's just this kind of a still image, but at least there's captions there. One thing that I'll get asked a lot is this 100% accessible? And I'm like, I don't know. Is there such thing? I'm not sure there really is.
Can I say to you, Keith, there's one of my friends who's visually impaired and she's an accessibility expert. And she did tell me once, she did literally say that. She was like, no one can ever get accessibility 100% right. Because everyone is going to have different, even people with the same impairments and conditions will have different needs that maybe they need to have met. And she kind of said, as someone is, she's quite vocal about calling people out when they get it wrong, but she does accept that, no one can ever get it 100% right all of the time. And that's what I do remind myself. I did a tweet yesterday, someone who's new, who kind of found conscious being, and so they're new to the community and the magazine, and they were asking me, is issue 2 going to be fully accessible? And I'm like, I said, I went back to her, I tweeted straight away and I said, we use a platform called FlipSnack, which has different accessibility profiles, including for screen reader. So it's the most accessible digital online platform that we could find for the magazine. And we also provide a plain text document version of the magazine for people that need it. And at the end I put, and we also welcome feedback. Right. So it's like, if we don't meet your access needs, please feedback to us and we will try and do better next time. I think it's all you can say when it comes to access. I mean, you can try and think of everything, but it's guaranteed you're going to miss something.
Yeah.
Very true. Well, Liz, a question for you. I noticed that a number of your writings on the Conscious Being blog, which we haven't really talked about, they talk about the experiences of women with autism. Can you talk about this intersection and how representation in that area is valuable?
Yeah, for sure. So Conscious Being started off as a blog when it's now become a magazine. So we're not on the blog quite as much anymore. But certainly I had a number of writers who are autistic approach me and really wanting to talk about their experience of being autistic. And for me, I think, I have a number of family members who are autistic, and a number of friends who are autistic, and I certainly feel an affinity, and I want to be a really strong and supportive ally for autistic people. And so I saw that opportunity to amplify that particular community's voices using the platform that I was creating. And one of my regular writers, Lydia, she comes up with just brilliant ideas, and really, in a way, it's through her writing, it's about not just educating other people who are reading her work, but it's educating me as well on how I can be a better ally and understand autism a lot better, certainly. And I just think, in light of especially the past year where we've had not the best representation in terms of movies, and here I'm thinking of The Witches with Anne Hathaway, where she portrayed the Grand High Witch. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. And they made her up to look like she had limb difference. That really upset me and hurt me. And really, I'm connected to a few limb different charities where they kind of support a lot of children with limb difference. And I was seeing children who were in tears over this movie, and it just broke my heart. I thought, this is not the representation that we need. And then literally weeks after that, Sia released her movie Music, which again was really horrific and not great representation of autism. And even though they're completely different conditions and impairments, and I can never say that I know what life is like for an autistic person, same as they can't say they know exactly what life is like for someone like me with limb difference. But I could understand their pain because I'd literally just been through it with the Witches movie. So for me, it's very important that I can support the autistic community in getting the stories out about their lived experience, especially for autistic women. A lot of the time, autistic women get very late diagnoses because they learn as they're growing up how to mask perhaps their mannerisms, their thought processes, their behaviors. So they learn how to mask that. And so they don't necessarily have the profile or representation that autistic men have, even though I'm not saying that any autistic representation is absolutely fantastic, but certainly for autistic women, I think it's a lot more difficult to get that authentic representation out there. So yeah, certainly as conscious being, I mean, we very much stand for intersection across race, across gender, across sexuality, across disability. But yeah, I certainly feel like it was really important, especially in the past 6 to 12 months, that I really amplify voices of autistic women.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. I mean, I know I mentioned at the beginning that I was a disability law attorney, but I spent the bulk of my career as a disability lawyer representing kids with disabilities, handling special education matters when they're having issues with the school district complying with their IEP. And so I've gone to a number of different CLE, legal education credit type conferences and things like that, and have learned that there is such a big difference in girls with autism versus boys with autism because of the masking component that Liz talked about. And so the representation is very important. I mean, I interviewed on the network someone who was Black and autistic about her experience. And I thought it was very interesting. I thought the interview was just fantastic. She co-authored a book with two other women, someone who's Asian, someone who's Latina, I believe. But the book itself is just written by all women, all with autism, talking about their lived experiences through different short stories. And just over the weekend, a Black woman watched the interview on YouTube, because that part of the channel is on YouTube also, and asked me about the book because she said she finally saw herself in someone who had the experience. She was late diagnosed with autism at the age of 25, and she had never met a Black woman before who had autism, and at least wanted the book to be able to read other stories. So yeah, I mean, I think sometimes people forget or underestimate the significance behind media representation and how it can validate who you are or sometimes invalidate who you are. So to try to get it right as much as you can is just so important.
Well, you mentioned your interview show, and that was one of the shows on Disability News Report that first caught my eye, and I went through a bunch of them. You certainly interview a very wide range of individuals, and I mean things that I never would have thought about, like augmented reality or virtual reality, and the challenges that someone with a disability has. Like it never would have occurred to me. So there was some really interesting stuff there. Is that sort of how the channel got started, in a sense, was with those interviews? I just, the Disability News Report kind of sounds like that's maybe what it began as, and then sort of grew from that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it started out with the interviews because I want to offer a platform where people could tell their stories. And I have always just enjoyed talking to people and learning of their stories. Yep. So yeah, I started out with the interviews, and once I started with different topic ideas and themes, so to speak, then I would search for people to see who was open and willing to talk about it. And so I would interview either people with a disability or people like with the virtual reality segment that you talked about, who offer a product, because the virtual reality, I'm not a gamer at all. So I definitely was just totally out of the loop on anything gaming. So definitely had no idea about virtual reality, but I just thought it was pretty awesome that he had come up with something to allow people with disabilities to still engage in the same way as non-disabled people. But yeah, that's how it got started. So those interviews are still on YouTube, and I waffle back and forth on doing another one, because when I first started another season, I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And then maybe in season 2, I'll do this. And then it grew into having a channel where I'm just more on the back end, just giving the platform to everyone else. So I haven't circled back to the interviews, but I enjoyed them. And sometimes people through Instagram will say, hey, you should do a topic on this and do a topic on that. So I still think that there will be more content regarding that, because I have it in me and I have such an interest in it.
Well, to close, I just wanted to hear a little bit about each of your thoughts on what the future holds for your platforms and where you see them going, what goals you seek to attain along the way. Liz?
Yeah, I mean, I would really love to see Conscious Being become as mainstream as possible. I'd love to be able to see it being a global publication that is in the stands alongside Vogue and Elle and all those really big magazines, because how cool would it be to be a disabled woman or non-binary person and walking into a supermarket and going, hey, there's a magazine for me with representation of me in it. So that is the massive goal, but obviously I don't see that happening for a few years. It might take a while to build and grow, but you know, certainly I want the magazine to grow and really build the readership, build the community. Even on social media, we're really starting to build a really strong, thoughtful community around the magazine, where I think people can actually talk about some of these issues that we raise in the magazine, you know, including gaming. Jennifer just mentioned gaming. In issue 2, we do have an article from one of our writers about how gaming actually helped her through mental health issues, which is really a really brilliant article. So yeah, I think it's just touching onto those topics necessarily thought of in relation to the disability community, but just showing or providing that representation for disabled people. But also part of it is that importance of showing non-disabled people that disabled people's lives are full and rich and have depth, and just like non-disabled people, we all have the same hang-ups and issues and problems, and we might have some extra struggles because of accessibility issues or stereotypes or beliefs and stuff, but in general we just want the same thing as non-disabled people, and that's what I really hope with Conscious Being, that we can be representative of that and informative for not just the disability community but the wider community at large.
Jennifer?
Sure. So I definitely am looking to gain audience, the viewership and everything like that. I also have a pretty ambitious long-term goal like Liz, in the sense that there was maybe a couple of months ago, I read an article about this valuable 500 where 500 CEOs said that they would make disability inclusion their business. So I think an ambitious long-term goal for me would be to tap one of those companies and actually get some sort of partnership or collaboration going with the network and see where that goes. And right now, people can view it online or either have to have a Roku to download the app to their device. But I would love to actually see it embedded, is the term that I'm using, on the Roku channel itself. So that would also be a nice long-term goal, or any other platform. I'm not married to Roku necessarily, but so that people can come across it the way they come across ABC Network.
Well, that'd be great. Those are both high goals, but I would love to see those goals attained sooner than later. Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for doing this. I really appreciate it, and good luck with everything. And I hope this is just another way to help get some more eyes and ears and hands on your different publications and media.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I think it's one of the wonderful things I love about the disability community. And as I expand my network, and I'm sure Jennifer feels the same, as you expand that network, I just find as a community, it's that level of support for the projects that we're all working on, that we all as different people, whether allies or disabled people, wherever, that we're all working on to raise the profile and representation of disability. Everyone is just so supportive and lifts each other up, because we all know how important it is, and that no one's in competition with each other. We're all aiming for the same goal, and we all want to achieve the same thing. And if we can support each other with that, I think that's brilliant. So thank you, Keith, so much.
Yeah, same, Keith. I do appreciate that. And I agree with Liz. There's definitely been an overwhelming attitude of what can I do to help? I just believe in the mission of your organization. So just tell me where I can fit in. So I certainly appreciate these opportunities with you, Keith, to be able to just continue to spread the word.
Well, thanks for giving us word to spread. Thanks again. Jennifer Price and Elizabeth Wright were great guests today, and we thank them for being on the podcast. You can find Disability News Report on the web at disabilitynewsreport.tv, or if you have a Roku device, you can find it for free in the channel store. To read and subscribe to Conscious Being magazine, check out flipsnack.com/Conscious Being magazine. Thank you for listening to the You First podcast or reading the transcript online. Please email any feedback, questions, or ideas about the show to podcast@disabilityrightsflorida.org.
The You First podcast is produced by Disability Rights Florida, a not-for-profit corporation working to protect and advance the rights of Floridians with disabilities through advocacy and education. If you or a family member has a disability and feel that your rights have been violated in any way, please contact Disability Rights Florida. You can learn more about the services we provide, explore a vast array of resources on a variety of disability-related topics, and complete an online intake on our website at disabilityrightsflorida.org. You can also call us at 1-800-342-0823. Thank you for listening to You First, the Disability Rights Florida podcast.